Hi everyone, so Season 5 has been out for a little bit and I've been blasting on the Druid among other classes, and I had a ton of fun with the Stormslide build that you're seeing here. This is a mix of Landslide and Lightning Storm. This is based on the Earthbreaker unique and the Unsung Ascetics Wraps unique for Lightning Storm. So you try to combine those two, and then you have Nature's Fury key passive to trigger Lightning Storms all the time when you cast Landslide. It's a very powerful build. In fact, it got buffed quite a lot in Season 5. I've been playing it on a PDR already and now in the season as well. I've been following mostly Boiler's Maxwell guides for this, so there were some slight tweaks I made, but it's a very nice setup. So I will be showing that off a little bit and explain a little bit the journey and the transition points and what to be aware of when you play this build. So far I've been playing this here on my hardcore Druid. For example, clear some in tier 6 Infernal Hordes, even including the Butcher, and the damage is really high. This can easily go to tier 7 once I min-max it a little bit more. What I have here right now is not very high end yet. I have mostly like low masterworking levels and 0 to 1 GA affix items. So nothing crazy, of course, because it's very early in the season and I've been playing other classes. And once this is more optimized, tier 7 Infernal Hordes is not really going to be a huge problem, and the Tormentor bosses are easy with this. I actually killed Lilith with this build, no problems. I just kind of destroyed her basically. I can maybe show that off. And also, for example, farming Pit all the way to like tier 100s in like 2.5-3 minutes or so is very comfortable already at this point. And it just gets better from there. In fact, on the Maxwell endgame tier list, we have this build listed as S tier. Druids are generally looking pretty solid this season, in particular because of this build, but they also have some other stuff going on that is pretty good. So I want to show you what it's all about with the Stormslide Druid. There are multiple variations of playing this. I'll be showing off the combination basically of Lightning Storm and Landslide. There is also a pure Landslide build that, at least in Season 4, was kind of the most DPS version, at least for single target damage for the Druids. But this season, it seems like the Lightning Storm stuff has been buffed a little bit more. There is like some weird stuff going on with like these lots of Lightning Storms coming down, as you can see. And that apparently has been improved somehow through the patch. So it seems like Stormslide is the better variation, in particular also because it gives you much more AoE damage. So when you like have, for example, Infernal Hordes, like you see here, this AoE coverage is just very helpful that you get from the Lightning Storms. And you actually have a combination of relatively good single target damage and high AoE clear potential. You can also see this here on the council fight. For example, on this tier 6 Infernal Horde, you have pretty high boss damage. Especially if you stagger bosses, you get a bit of an extra boost from various modifiers. It's not as bad as on the Rogue, where you have to stagger bosses to deal damage, but it's a nice extra. And as I mentioned, for example, other high-end bosses also kind of fall pretty easily. So here, for example, is my clip from killing Uber Lilith with this build. It just kind of has a lot of stagger from all the stun procs that you get from landsliding, for example, and then you can just kind of take her down with basically one stagger nuke. This was not even really good. And as I mentioned, there's also multiple variations of playing this. So for example, you can play the Landslide or the Stormslide. You can also play this, for example, with the Cataclysm Ring. A lot of people ask me about the Cataclysm Ring and you know, having Cataclysm instead of Petrify, for example. That is an option. It's, for example, solves your resources entirely because the Mjolnir ring allows you to just spend no resources, but on the other hand, you also have to build your paragons differently. You can't go for Ancestral Guidance because you can't trigger that anymore, and it overall does just a little bit less damage. So the Petrify version is the stronger version of this, but it requires a bit more like kind of setup with the resources and a little bit more attention to the resource management. But overall, the resources are fine, as you can see here. So the idea is they kind of spam Landslide as much as possible. Sometimes cast a Poison Creeper, which allows you to also regain some resources through various procs. And then sometimes, roughly every 4 seconds, you want to do the Storm Strike, because it also gives you a buff. And how it all works, well, we can see it here in the Landslide, a Druid guide. This is made by Boiler. He's also streaming, by the way, so maybe drop him a follow. He has been theory crafting and building a lot of these Maxwell guides in the past until now as well. And we have the planner here. So this is Boiler's planner. This is not my own. As I mentioned, I did make my own, but in the end, I didn't have time after the patch notes to go back and, you know, min-max all of the little details after the you know, like the patch notes dropped basically with the final results of the unique changes and so on. So I just kind of went with his setup and I really liked it as well. There's just a few small tweaks that I have done myself. What is important for the setup to work is this Earthbreaker ring that I talked about. This gives you this double landslide effect. It also has really good stats. You see here, chance to cast landslide twice, lots of crit, landslide ranks, like everything on this thing is insane. So this is really good. And this Earthbreaker ring somehow does something weird with Nature's Fury and Lightning Storm. So when you have Nature's Fury, you have a 35% chance to cast a Lightning Storm when you cast landslide. And for some reason, with this Earthbreaker ring, it kind of just keeps going and it procs a lot. So this Lightning Storm actually is kind of like not just one cast that you trigger, but it's like an entire channel. So it kind of keeps going for like 5 seconds or so. So you can, like, I think, overlap them even, and you just have lightning storms going all the time. So most of your AoE damage is going to be the lightning storm, and then I think for single target it's like somewhat even, landslide, lightning storm. They both contribute there. So you want to invest into both skills, and you deal damage with both. This is like a true kind of hybrid storm and earth build, basically. So this is based on the Earthbreaker and then the Unsung Ascetics wraps here. This also gives you the double lightning strike and more damage, and then lots of lightning storm ranks. So there's a pretty huge buff here on the build, even though this does not buff landslide really. You have crit chance, quite a lot of it actually, and then the defiance ranks, which is nice. There's a passive down here that gives you extra elite damage. So that is pretty good to have. And then it gives you this insane lightning storm damage here. And lastly, a third unique that I want to try to get first before I start to build is Vasili's Prayer. This allows you to get a lot of the bear synergies. There's a bunch of stuff on the Paragons, for example, and also some on the tree here. And also it's a very defensive item. So it gives you the Fortify, so you don't have to invest anywhere else there. It gives you the armor that you need, basically, so very easy to reach the armor cap. It has good stats in general, and then gives you defensive posture, which is a defensive passive here. So on a really juicy roll like this, you can get up to 10 ranks of defensive posture. And then with 3 invested, you can get 39% damage reduction from a single source here. This is basically 2 defensive aspects, and it's pretty crazy. So you want to have this. It's not 100% required to start the build, but there's also other synergies that unlock when you have this bear transformation here. Because, for example, there's Quick Shift. Quick Shift is a very powerful passive on the Druids. So if you don't have the Vasili's Prayer, you will not be able to use this very well. For example, there's also Wild Heart Hunger. It's an optional item. It is a lot of extra damage. You need to make sure that you shift once every 5 seconds in order to maintain this buff, but it goes up to 60% extra damage. In fact, in the clips that you saw there at the start, I was not actually using them, I believe, because I didn't have any Wild Heart Hunger for a while. I only found them later, and this can still go much more powerful, basically, when you have items like these in the build. I was just running some random boots that didn't really give me much. Yeah, I didn't have another option, basically. But there is a lot of shifting involved, and you shift very easily. Every time you cast Landslide, you will transform into bear form, thanks to Vasili's Prayer. And then you just need to make sure that once every 5 seconds, you actually transform out of bear form and do something else. So one Storm Strike or a Poison Creeper, this also transforms you in human form, for example. Bloodhowl transforms you into werewolf form. I'm not sure about Petrify. I think Petrify also transforms you into human form. So basically anything you press besides Bulwark transforms you back out of bear form or directly into another form to get the shifting effect. So for Quick Shift, there's an 8 seconds timer. For Wild Heart, there's a 5 seconds timer. But shifting every 5 seconds is very easily done. Bloodhowl, for example, is something that you press a lot while speedrunning. So if you like just like run through like easy nightmare dungeons or easy pits or something, then Bloodhowl resets its cooldown every time you kill an enemy, and you get -1 second. So when you just constantly destroy big packs, you just press Bloodhowl while running. It doesn't even slow you down. So you already get this transformation effect very easily. And the Storm Strike is also here because we have the aspect of natural balance on the neck. So it says that when you cast a storm skill, you get plus 67.5% crit damage for your earth skills. This also benefits twice for your storms, lightning storms. So with Nature's Fury, it says that these 3 casts, like the lightning storm that you get from casting Landslide, have both earth and storm benefits, basically. So in the case of natural balance, as long as this is active, which it will be for the earth side, since you cast Landslide all the time, you get this crit chance buff for your lightning storm. And then if you also cast a Storm Strike every 4 seconds, you get this crit damage buff, which is pretty significant since you have a lot of crit chance in this setup anyway. And you get both bonuses for your lightning storm. So this is really powerful. There's another few important aspects here. We have the aftershock. This is for the second landslide pillar, so it basically doubles the amount of hits. Then you have the retaliation here. This is up to 40% core skill damage, very powerful druid aspect. And we have the subterranean. This allows you, when you cast Poison Creeper, to spawn like a circle of landslides around you. This is relatively nice. It can only proc one lightning storm, so it's not really like crazy for the lightning storms, but it gives you like kind of like free damage all around you. And the Poison Creeper also allows you to unlock all of those poison synergies, in particular Envenom. Envenom is like the strongest passive in the entire game, basically. So every Druid build runs this, but it's not like Wind Shear or something. This is 10% extra crit damage per rank against poison enemies, so you always want to poison enemies. There's also, for example, on the Paragons, Heightened Malice. So when there's 3 or more poison enemies around, you get a 45% damage bonus. Very powerful legendary node here. So basically in AoE packs, you want to try to press a Poison Creeper here and there to get those poison synergies, and then it poisons the enemies for up to 6 seconds here. So you don't have to press it like all the time. 6 seconds is a pretty long time, and you easily reset it as well with the pack leader node here. So you get a 25% chance like hit when you crit that you get a cooldown reset on your companions. And in AoE packs, this happens every second basically. Even on bosses, they will proc this like every 1 or 2 seconds or so. And this allows you to constantly get this poison rolling and get free damage. You might be wondering, how do you actually get resources on this build? You just have Stormstrike. Now, you don't want to just like Stormstrike enemies in order to get resources. That is kind of slow, at least for like endgame standards. And instead, you see here on the weapon, for example, and on the offhand, there's this lucky hit, chance to restore resources. This is the kind of the key here. In order to get your resources high, you want to have this at least on a weapon and probably one more slot. I have it as a temper as well on my ring. In this planner right now we have resource generation, but you can also get this lucky hit, chance to restore resources as a temper on your ring, and also, for example, here on the totem. If you have 3 sources of this, it should feel fairly comfortable. You have a lot of lucky hit chance in this build thanks to all of these procs going on and the double landslides or quadruple landslides that happen with the Earthbreaker, for example. So you have a lot of hits, a lot of opportunities to proc this, and this is kind of what raises your resources all the time. And if you sometimes run out, then you can do a bit of storm striking, or you do a Poison Creeper. This is why I want to mention this now. Poison Creeper doesn't cost resources, but it can trigger lucky hits when you have all these landslides going on. So this is also a good way to restore resources actually in AoE fights in particular. So this is also something you can use in that case. Once you have a really good setup with like masterwork gear and so on, I think you can get away with only 2 lucky hit chance to restore resource rolls. So I would recommend the weapon and then the temper on the ring, or maybe a temper on the neck as well. So here's movement speed, for example, that is kind of optional, I would say. And you can put like another resource restore there, for example, or a resource generation roll or something, and this makes it much smoother. Also in the early game, what I was doing when I didn't have Wild Heart Hunger, I just had a pair of boots that had some spirit per second. That helped out a little bit. In general, resource management is a little bit crucial here in the setup, and I hear from people that play the setup that they are running out of resources sometimes. So if you want to make it more comfy, try to put more emphasis on those lucky hit chance to restore resources. If you get 3 of them, you should generally be fine. There's also another option in the very late game. If you get a Starless Skies ring, you could replace the subterranean aspect, and then you can put the lucky hit chance to restore resource on the neck. As I mentioned, for example, Starless Skies gives you up to 50% resource cost reduction. So once you ramp up that buff, you're gonna have no trouble really keeping your resources high, and it should be fairly easy. But you have to go up the subterranean, so you don't get this circle of landslides around you. Instead, you have to sustain with just spamming landslides and then all the procs. But it should generally make it easier and more powerful, because the Starless Skies ring has incredible stats, lots of crit, attack speed that's really valuable, and then of course the 50% damage buff. There are also some other options to solve the resources a bit early on. So for example, instead of the attack speed Bloodhowl, you can go for the Spirit Bloodhowl. That's what I was doing very early when I started this build. This just helped me out a little bit to like cast stuff, especially while speedrunning, while I was farming gear. So this is a nice option here. If you want, maybe for something like, lower end content, Hell Tides or something, maybe just put a second ring that has like an umbral aspect or so. This will make it easy, like super smooth. You're not gonna have any worries about anything, but this is not really an endgame option. Or if you are quite desperate, you could also try to, for example, remove the second Spirit Bone here and then put it on the Wolf and get Energized. So you can do the Pack Leader and Energize to get the Restore Spirit here. So there are various options here to solve the resource a little bit. or as I mentioned earlier at the start, the Mjolnir Ring and the Cataclysm setup, but it requires a little bit of respecking. You would have to get, for example, some points for Endless Tempest in order to make this work, maybe some more cooldown. So this is a bit of a different setup, but this is also an option to solve resources. In Boiler setup here, we also have Tibalt's Will to get resources. So every time you gain Unstoppable when you're not already unstoppable, you get 50 resources, so it's also multiplied with, for example, your bonuses here. The intelligence gives you extra resource generation, for example, so this is probably more like 60 or so resource gen, or even more when you have a roll here. And this is also pretty nice to sustain resources with Earthen Bulwark. And here, for example, it has symbiotic aspect to reset the Earthen Bulwark. So every time you cast Storm Strike, and then Storm Strike triggers, let's say, an Earth Spike from Nature's Fury, you will get a 5 seconds cooldown reset on your Earthen Bulwark. However, the idea is that you don't really cast Stormslide very often because you just want to get this buff every 4 seconds and then sustain landslides as much as possible and just spam those as much as possible. So personally, I didn't really like the symbiotic choice here, and instead I went for a defensive power, the Spirit Bond power. So you just get damage reduction from this. I kind of like that, and I didn't go for the symbiotic stuff. So I also felt that Tibalt's Will, I didn't really want to do this, and I want to be a bit more tanky. It is an okay item, but the damage reduction on Unstoppable is not very consistent since Earthen Bulwark does have a rather long cooldown, and I barely cast Storm Strike, at least with my playstyle. So I replaced Tibalt's Will with a normal pair of pants basically, and instead I went for Tyrio's Might chest. So Tyrio's Might is just like, really powerful item. So this is what I did. I put the Spirit Bond on the pants as damage reduction, and then Tyrio's Might as a chest for even more damage reduction, and I just barely use Earthen Bulwark. So in Boiler setup, for example, there is a lot more Earthen Bulwark casting going on with the symbiotic, but I kind of just keep it as like a, oh shit button basically for hardcore when I get CC'd and I need to get out of it. It has the Unstoppable, and this is mostly what I use it for. I barely press it. I don't really get the barrier like a sustain or so. It's not very hard to sustain on this build because you have a lot of healing thanks to, for example, Circle of Life. Every time you cast nature magic skills, you get extra healing, for example. You have the Blood Howl for healing. So you don't really need a barrier to sustain. It's mostly just for the Unstoppable. And in that case, I felt I'd rather keep it for the really dangerous moments. For the Paragons, it looks like this. So this is a 7-board setup that Boiler has made here. And I really enjoyed this Paragon actually. So I actually didn't really do any adjustments. The only change I made here was that I removed the Dominate Glyph and I put Undaunted Glyph just for like a bit more of a hardcore choice. I would say this is pretty optional. And this Dominate Glyph is fairly good choice, to be honest. Even though there's no guaranteed overpower triggers in this build, you have so many hits, so many casts that allows you to actually get those opportunities to get an overpower pretty often. Like if you look at the numbers, you see those orange numbers or these teal numbers quite often on the overpowers, especially on boss fights. You can get a pretty juicy 15% damage buff there pretty much all the time. Other than that, I basically just went one-to-one with this setup. I really think this is a good Paragon board. So we have the Spirit Glyph here for the extra crit damage and ramping effect. Fang and Claw for the extra close damage effect here when you're in Bear form, which you are basically all the time thanks to Basilis. Also buffs some pretty good notes here. Get some rest, get some crit. Then Dominate or Undaunted, as I mentioned here, they both have the same int requirement, so you can just swap them out. Then we have Earth and Sky here. This buffs the pretty big life nodes. So this is on the Constricted Handle board. You have these big life nodes here that they want to buff. And this is just also extra damage here with the nature magic skills. We have Survival Instincts here. This gives you up to a 60% damage bonus when you are high life and monsters are low life. So on average, something like a 30% damage bonus. Relatively strong. Also here's like a nice damage reduction node to Bulwark. Then we have the Thunderstruck node here. This is mostly to buff the Lightning Storm. This is Storm Scale. You want to stack a little bit of close and damage reduction bonuses to get this to 60%. And we have the Territorial Glyph here for close damage reduction. And lastly, there's the Heightened Malice. So also with nearby poison enemies, you have extra damage. This comes mostly from the Poison Creepers, so it presses quite often. Another legendary note here that I didn't mention, Ancestral Guidance. Every 75 spirit you spend, you get 30% extra damage. So this is basically like 2 free casts or so. You get this bonus here. With Starter Skies in the mix, you have to do more like 5 casts probably to get this buff, but that should not really be any problem. It lasts 5 seconds, and 5 casts are easy to do with all the attack speed you got from, for example, here the swooping attacks, and you have attack speed on rings here and stuff like that, so you can kind of spam it pretty hard and get the Ancestral Guidance up, no problem. And there's also the Earth and Devastation node here that I should mention this. This needs you to stack crowd control damage, so you want to have both close, distant, and crowd control to stack up all those legendary Paragon nodes. And this is also what you can see here on the temper slots. Here's a crowd control temper, here's a crowd control temper, here's a close temper, here's a close temper, and then you have a bunch of distant damage on the unsung ascetic wraps. So once you start masterworking this stuff up, you will get to those caps here. So that's 60%. There's also 60% on the Thunderstruck. And those are the most important stats you want to put on your offensive tempers. And then the rest of the stats are mostly a lot of attack speed, a lot of crit chance. You want to try to hit the 100% chance to cast twice on your landslide. And then, of course, the chance to restore resources that I talked about earlier in the resource section. So you want to try to make sure that you have this. And then wherever you can, you want to try to get a bit of life as well. So you can get this on the offhand, you can get this on the weapon. Yeah, you don't really want it on the jewelry, but it's not really terrible since this is not really such a tanky setup here. This is why I also went for the Tyrus Might, for example. So for hardcore in particular, I think Tyrus Might is probably what you want to go for, especially if you're aiming for like tier 7 plus Infernal Hordes. You need to have quite some defenses to really make this work, and I didn't really want to go in that squishy and then potentially get one shot or something. Also, another small tweak I made, instead of the 15% attack speed, I went with the Iron Feather. But attack speed is pretty valuable because, first of all, you can cast more, get more procs, and I believe there's also some stuff going on with, if you have more attack speed, you trigger more lightning storms every time you get a trigger. So attack speed is really valuable in the setup in general. This is also why, for example, here when I try to ramp up attack speed, here's attack speed and so on. There's a lot of attack speed everywhere. And this is partly also thanks to this lightning storm effect that happens whenever you get your Nature's Fury procs. A last note about the stat requirements is also that if you use a Starter Skies, you will not have a good source of vulnerable anymore. This was here on the ring, so you want to have one roll with the chance to make vulnerable. And with Starter Skies, you will have to move this to the amulet to get vulnerable. Vulnerable is 20% damage. You kind of want to have that. So here I would probably replace the attack speed, for example, in that case. And also we have, for example, stuff like Natural Disaster where you do extra damage against vulnerable. So there's a bit of extra power there. And you want to make sure that you have one source of chance to make vulnerable. And this concludes pretty much the entire endgame setup. If you want to read up more on the landslide guide, we have it here on Maxwell. I will link this in the description as well. And there's also the entire progression. So you can, for example, check this out here. There's the Paragon slider, so you can see this step by step. And you can also see here, what do you want to unlock in the codex if you want to make this a bit easier early on, and what do you want to get later and so on. There's also the starter, early endgame, and variants that Boiler has made here. So this is like, you know, before you get all of those uniques, how do you play it? It's mostly a kind of trample slide, like old school trample slide build. Here you see there's trample in the mix. There's like the trampled earth aspect. So you can use trample as like a huge AoE nuke. This is very good while leveling. If you want to level up with this build to 100. Personally, I didn't do that in this season. I did it season 3 actually. I played a trample slide druid from 1 to 100. So that works pretty well. It also has been buffed since then. So even without the uniques, this will work just fine, getting to 100, and then you can try to start farming those bosses, get the Basilis, get the Earthbreaker, and get the Wildheart Hunger. Basilis, I think, drops from Zir, and I think Wildheart from Beast, and Earthbreaker from Grigor, if I'm not mistaken. But you can also always check that out here on our boss loot cheat sheet. So if you're always looking for any of those items, then yeah, we can check this. So you have Varshan that drops Basilis, Lord Zir, and then Wildheart is also Lord Zir, and then we have the Earthbreaker. So as I mentioned, this is a Grigor, exactly. So we got those, farm those 3 bosses, or 4 bosses even, and you will get those uniques, and then you can start working on this setup here. The Tibbetsville is kind of optional. As I mentioned, I actually removed that for my own. Wildheart Hunger is also somewhat optional. This is like more like endgame scaling. This is, you know, something you can go for later. But yeah, those 3 uniques here you want to have, and then the build really comes online and you can do the switch. Lastly, there is this pure landslide version here as well that Boiler has made. Right now, I'm not 100% sure how strong it is compared to the Stormslide version. So I kind of like the pure landslide as well. That's what I've mostly tried, for example, back on the PTR for season 5. It is very powerful as well. It does have a little bit of AoE clear. It has more single target damage as far as I know. So it has a lot of raw power basically. Very good for boss killing, for example. Maybe very good for, like, you know, pit pushing on a higher end, because it's mostly about killing the boss quickly as well. So I guess this might push higher, but the Stormslide version is more for the AoE damage and the farming as well. And since the raw power of this setup is already pretty high, it also can delete tormented bosses in parties relatively well. For example, I'm quite happy with this setup. And that concludes the guide here. So I hope you enjoyed this. Go check out this Maxwell guide here by Boiler as well. This is really good. Also, of course, send him some love, as I mentioned. So here you can click on his socials. And hope you enjoyed this Druid guide. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any other, versions or improvements or something for this. And of course, as always, see you guys next time.